Centuries of easy conquest, the Empire's greatest fleet was ended by one human warship. For 300 years, the Vorlon Empire had never lost a war. Not one, not a single battle that mattered. The Empire had grown from a single star system into a power that ruled over 400 worlds, and it had done this without ever meeting an enemy that could truly fight back. Every species the Vorlons found was either too weak, too slow, or too divided to stand against the Empire's fleets. The Vorlons did not think of themselves as cruel. They thought of themselves as simply better. Stronger ships, older technology, more disciplined soldiers. When a Vorlon fleet arrived at a new world, the outcome was already decided before the first shot was fired. This had happened so many times that the Vorlon High Command had stopped calling their wars wars at all. They called them collections. A world was found, a fleet was sent, and the world was collected into the Empire, like a stone picked up from a beach. The Vorlon Empire was ruled from a home system called Koth, where 3 suns lit a purple sky over a capital world of glass towers and endless military shipyards. The Empire's government was called the Dominion Council, made up of the oldest and most decorated Vorlon admirals, all of whom had won their medals in wars that were never close. The current head of the council was Grand Admiral Threxus Val, a Vorlon who had commanded fleets in 11 separate campaigns and had never once lost a ship in a battle that could be called even. Threxus Val was proud of this. He kept a record of every campaign in his private quarters, a wall covered in medals and small models of enemy ships that had been destroyed under his command. He believed, as most Vorlons believed, that conquest was simply the natural order of things. The strong took, and the weak gave. This was not cruelty. This was just how the universe worked. It was Threxus Val who received the first report about the humans. The report came from a scout ship called the Silent Drifter, a small vessel whose only job was to travel along the edges of Vorlon space and look for new worlds to add to the Empire. The scout ship's captain, a young Vorlon officer named Ren Ashari, had been ordered to investigate a strange signal coming from a system near the edge of known space. The signal was not like anything the Vorlons had seen before. It was not a natural radio signal from a star or a planet. It had structure. It had rhythm. It sounded, in a strange way, like a voice. Ren Ashari took the Silent Drifter closer to the signal's source, a small yellow star with 8 planets, and there she found something that made her pause. The 3rd planet from the star was blue and green, covered in oceans and clouds, and around it she detected faint traces of technology, radio waves, satellites, small orbital stations. It was clearly the world of a young, growing civilization. Ren had seen dozens of worlds like this before, worlds just beginning to leave their planet and step into space. Normally, such worlds were easy. The Vorlon Empire loved finding worlds like this, because a young species with new technology had no chance against a fleet built from 300 years of unbroken victory. But something about this signal was different, and Ren Ashari could not say exactly why. There was something in the rhythm of it, something almost aggressive, like a drumbeat before a battle. She recorded everything she could, and sent her findings back to the nearest Vorlan relay station, along with a short note that read, "Recommend further study before contact." This species may not behave as expected. It was a small thing to write, a single line in a much longer report, but it was the first warning anyone in the Vorlon Empire ever received about the species that called itself humanity. No one paid it any attention. The report reached Koth 3 weeks later, and it was handed to a mid-level officer named Dos Kellerin, whose job was to review scout reports and decide which ones were worth the Council's time. Dos read the report quickly. He saw a young world with early space technology, no visible fleet, no signs of any real military presence beyond a handful of orbital stations. To him, it looked exactly like 100 other worlds the Empire had already conquered. He filed it under standard contact priority and moved on to the next report. Ren Ashari's warning about the strange signal was noted, but not acted on. Dos Kellerin had seen many scout captains write cautious notes about worlds that turned out to be nothing. He assumed this was the same. 6 months later, the Vorlon Empire sent its first official contact mission to the human system. This was standard procedure. Before a full invasion fleet was sent, the Empire always sent a smaller diplomatic and reconnaissance group, both to assess the target more closely and, if possible, to offer the species a chance to surrender peacefully and join the Empire without a fight. Most species accepted this offer once they saw the size of the ships that came to deliver it. The contact mission was led by an ambassador named Tressa Own, aboard a heavily armed cruiser called the Golden Word. It was not truly meant for diplomacy. It was meant to show strength. The Golden Word arrived at the edge of the human system and immediately broadcast a message on every frequency the humans might be using. The message, translated by the ship's language systems after listening to human broadcasts for several days, was simple. It said that the Vorlon Empire had claimed this system as its own, that resistance was pointless, and that the species known as humanity had one full day to respond with terms of surrender before the Empire would be forced to take further action. The response came faster than anyone expected. It was not a message, it was a single ship. The ship that approached the Golden Word was small compared to Vorlon vessels, barely a third of its size, gray and angular, with no decoration or markings beyond a simple emblem near its bow. To the sensors of the Golden Word, it did not even register as a proper warship. It had no visible weapons array that matched anything in the Vorlon database. Ambassador Tressa Own assumed it was a shuttle, perhaps carrying a human representative who wished to negotiate in person. She ordered her crew to prepare a formal welcome. The ship did not slow down. It did not respond to any hailing signal. It simply came closer and closer, and by the time the Golden Word's sensors understood what they were looking at, it was already too late. The gray ship fired a single weapon, a kind of projectile the Vorlons had never seen before, moving faster than anything in their records, and it struck the Golden Word's main reactor core directly. The explosion tore the cruiser apart in seconds. Every soul aboard, including Ambassador Tressa Own, was killed instantly. The gray ship did not stay to fight further. It turned and disappeared back toward the human homeworld, leaving behind only wreckage and a stunned silence across Vorlon communication channels. It had taken less than 4 minutes from the moment the human ship appeared to the moment the Golden Word ceased to exist. News of the disaster reached Koth within days, carried by a small escort vessel that had been trailing the Golden Word at a distance and had watched the entire event unfold through long-range sensors. When Grand Admiral Threxus Val received the report, he did not believe it at first. In 300 years, no single enemy ship had ever destroyed a Vorlon cruiser in open combat, let alone one carrying an ambassador and a full diplomatic escort. He ordered the escort vessel's sensor logs to be reviewed by every analyst on Koth, certain that some mistake had been made, that perhaps a reactor malfunction or an accident had been misread as an attack. The logs were clear. There had been no malfunction. A single human ship, no larger than a light escort vessel, had destroyed a Vorlon cruiser with one shot, using a weapon the Empire's scientists could not identify. Worse, the human ship had shown no fear, no hesitation, and no interest in negotiation. It had simply killed the ambassador and left. Threxus Val called an emergency session of the Dominion Council. The mood in the chamber was not one of fear, it was one of anger. Many of the council members, veterans of 100 easy wars, saw this not as a sign of danger, but as an insult. A young species, barely capable of leaving its own solar system, had dared to destroy a ship flying the Empire's colors. Several admirals argued that this was clearly some kind of trick, a lucky shot, or a weapon the humans could not possibly use more than once. One admiral, a stern old warrior named Corvain Des, argued the opposite. He had reviewed the sensor data personally and pointed out something troubling. The human ship's weapon had shown a rate of fire and an accuracy that suggested it was not a lucky shot at all, but the result of careful, deliberate engineering. He warned the council that humanity might be more dangerous than they appeared. Threxus Val listened to both sides, but in the end, his pride made the decision for him. He stood before the council and declared that the Empire would not be humiliated by a single ship from an unproven species. He proposed sending not a small task force, but the Empire's largest and most powerful fleet, a force called the Ashfire Armada, made up of over 200 warships, led by Threxus Val himself. The Ashfire Armada had never been fully deployed before. It was the pride of the Vorlon military, built over decades, filled with the newest weapons and the most experienced crews in the Empire. Sending it against a single, unproven world would not just conquer humanity, it would erase the memory of the Golden Word's destruction and remind the galaxy exactly who ruled it. The council approved the plan almost unanimously. Only Corvain Des voted against it, and even he did not vote against sending a fleet, only against the idea of dismissing the humans as weak before truly understanding what had destroyed the Golden Word. His objection was noted and ignored. While the Vorlon Empire prepared its greatest fleet for war, on the blue and green world called Earth, humanity was doing something the Vorlons did not expect. They were not celebrating a victory, they were preparing. The destruction of the Golden Word had not been a lucky accident, and it had not been an act of blind aggression either. It had been a calculated, deliberate warning, carried out by a single ship called the UES Hammerfall, captained by a woman named Elena Reyes. Humanity had detected the Golden Word's approach weeks before it arrived, had studied its broadcasts, had translated its ultimatum, and had made a decision as a species. They would not wait to be conquered. They would show the newcomers, whoever they were, that Earth was not an easy target. Humanity had a long and painful history of war with itself. Centuries of conflict between nations had, in a strange way, prepared humanity for exactly this moment. Unlike the Vorlon Empire, which had never faced a true equal in 300 years, humanity had spent its entire history fighting enemies who were sometimes stronger, sometimes smarter, and sometimes better equipped. Humans had learned, over and over again, that victory did not always belong to the side with the biggest army. It belonged to the side that adapted fastest, that used its environment and its enemies' mistakes against them, and that never stopped looking for a better way to fight. When the first signs of an approaching alien presence were detected, years before the Golden Word ever arrived, Earth's governments had done something unprecedented. Faced with a threat greater than any nation, they had set aside their old rivalries and formed a single unified defense command, later known simply as Earth Fleet. It was not a large fleet. Humanity did not have the resources to build hundreds of warships. But every ship humanity built was designed with total focus, drawing on centuries of military history, cutting-edge physics, and a simple, brutal understanding. They might only get one chance to prove they could not be conquered easily. The UES Hammerfall was the first ship of a new class, designed specifically with the idea that any enemy fleet would be larger and more numerous than anything humanity could build. Its systems were built not for a long, grinding war, but for speed, precision, and shock. Its main weapon, later called the rail spike by its own crew, fired a solid projectile at such extreme speed that it could punch through armor that no energy weapon could touch, using pure kinetic force rather than exotic energy the Vorlons might be able to shield against. Humanity's scientists reasoned that any alien species which had ruled for centuries without real resistance would have shields and armor designed to stop the kinds of weapons other alien species used. A simple, brutally fast metal spike, they guessed, might be something no one had ever needed to defend against. Captain Elena Reyes had been chosen to command the Hammerfall not because of politics or rank alone, but because of her record. She had served in 2 of Earth's last major conflicts before unification, had commanded smaller vessels in dangerous conditions, and was known among her peers for a calm, almost cold way of making decisions under pressure. She did not believe in speeches or displays of anger. She believed in results. When the order came to intercept the Golden Word and prevent any diplomatic exchange from taking place, she carried it out exactly as planned, without hesitation, because she understood something the Vorlons did not yet understand about her people. Humanity would rather die fighting than live as a conquered species, and it would use everything it had learned about war to make that fight as painful as possible for anyone who came to take their freedom. After destroying the Golden Word, Elena Reyes returned to Earth and delivered a full report to Earth Fleet Command. She did not celebrate the victory. She warned everyone who would listen that this had only been the first ship, a scout and a diplomat, and that whatever species had sent it would not accept this loss quietly. She was right. Earth Fleet's intelligence division, watching the edges of the system for any sign of activity, soon detected the unmistakable signs of a massive fleet gathering far beyond the system's border. Long-range sensors, combined with data gathered from captured Vorlon communication buoys near the system's edge, gave humanity a rough picture of what was coming. It was not a small punishment force. It was something much larger, something that would dwarf anything Earth Fleet could put into space. Earth's leaders were given the choice between 2 paths: They could attempt to flee, scattering humanity across hidden colonies, and hoping the Vorlon Empire would eventually give up the search. Or they could stand and fight, using everything they had built, everything they had learned, and every advantage their unique history of conflict could give them, in the hope of proving to this new enemy that Earth was not worth the cost of conquest. The vote, taken across every remaining human government still connected to Earth Fleet Command, was almost unanimous. Humanity would not run, it would fight. Preparations began immediately. Every shipyard in the solar system was put to work, though everyone in command understood that there was no way to build a fleet capable of matching 200 Vorlon warships in raw numbers. Instead, Earthfleet made a decision that would define the coming battle. Rather than trying to build many ships to match the Empire's numbers, they would refine and multiply what had already worked. More Hammerfall-class vessels were rushed into construction, though only a handful could be completed in time. Elena Reyes herself was placed in command of the small defense force that would meet the coming fleet, a position she accepted without complaint, though she knew better than anyone the size of what was approaching. Grand Admiral Threxus Vol, meanwhile, prepared the Ashfire Armada for what he believed would be a short and satisfying campaign. He gathered every commander under his authority for a final briefing before departure, standing before a massive display that showed the human system and its single inhabited world. He told his officers that this campaign would be remembered not for its difficulty, but for how quickly it corrected the mistake made by an overconfident species that had dared to strike first. He reminded them of the Empire's 300 years of victory, of every world that had bent the knee before Vorlon power, and he promised them that humanity's world would be added to that list within weeks. Only Corvain Des, standing quietly near the back of the briefing room, did not share in the confidence of his fellow officers. He had studied the sensor logs from the Golden Word's destruction more closely than anyone else in the Empire, and something about the precision of that single shot stayed with him. He said nothing during the briefing. He had already voted, already been overruled, and there was nothing left to do but prepare his own ships for what was coming, and hope that his caution, unlike his warning, would not go unheeded when the moment came. As the Ashfire Armada gathered its ships and prepared to depart from Koth, 206 warships strong, carrying the pride and the certainty of 3 centuries of unbroken conquest, on a small blue and green world at the edge of known space, humanity waited. Shipyards worked without rest. Engineers refined every weapon system they had. Soldiers and pilots trained for a battle they knew they were unlikely to win by simple numbers alone. And Captain Elena Reyes stood on the bridge of the UES Hammerfall, watching the stars, knowing that somewhere out there, a fleet unlike anything her species had ever faced was already on its way. The Empire believed it was coming to collect another easy prize, just as it had 200 times before. It did not yet understand that it was sailing toward the one enemy in 300 years of history that had no intention of losing, no matter what the cost. The Ashfire Armada did not travel to the human system all at once. Grand Admiral Threxus Vol, despite his confidence, was not a foolish commander. 300 years of Vorlon military tradition had taught even the most arrogant admirals to send a forward element ahead of the main fleet, a smaller group of ships whose job was to scout the target system, confirm the location of any defenses, and clear the way for the larger force to arrive without surprise. This forward element was called the Vanguard Wing, and it was made up of 12 warships, smaller and faster than the main battle line, commanded by an officer named Kellen Thur. Kellen Thur was young for his rank, but he had earned it honestly, leading successful campaigns against 3 separate worlds in the outer colonies. He was ambitious, confident, and eager to prove himself in front of Grand Admiral Vol. When he was given command of the Vanguard Wing and ordered to scout the human system ahead of the main armada, he saw it as an opportunity, not a danger. He expected to find a handful of primitive orbital defenses, perhaps a few armed shuttles, and nothing that could truly be called a fleet. The destruction of the Golden Word in his mind had been a single lucky strike, the kind of thing that happened once in a war and never again. The Vanguard Wing entered the human system 8 days ahead of the main fleet, moving in a standard formation that had worked for the Empire in dozens of previous campaigns. Kellen Thur ordered his ships to spread out and begin a full sensor sweep of the system, looking for shipyards, military bases, and any sign of the vessel that had destroyed the Golden Word. He fully expected to find that vessel sitting undefended near the human homeworld, an easy target for the first strike of the coming war. What he found instead was silence. Earthfleet had learned from the destruction of the Golden Word that surprise was one of humanity's greatest advantages, and Earthfleet Command had no intention of giving that advantage away by announcing its exact numbers and positions to the first scouting party that arrived. Every human ship capable of combat had been moved into hidden positions, tucked behind asteroids, moons, and debris fields left over from the early days of the solar system. Sensor decoys were placed throughout the system, designed to give any incoming scan a confusing and inaccurate picture of what defenses actually existed. Kellen Thur's sensors detected faint traces of ships and stations, but nothing that matched what his instincts told him should be there. It was as if humanity's entire defense force had simply vanished. Frustrated but not yet alarmed, Kellen Thur ordered the Vanguard wing to move closer to Earth itself, believing that a show of force near the homeworld would either draw out the defenders or force a surrender before the main armada even arrived. It was a decision that would cost him dearly. Elena Reyes had been tracking the Vanguard wing since the moment it entered the system. Earthfleet's sensor network, though limited compared to what the Vorlan Empire could deploy, had been built with a single purpose in mind: detecting exactly this kind of scouting force before it detected Earth's true defenses. She watched the 12 Vorlan ships move deeper into the system, spreading into a loose formation that, to her trained eye, showed exactly the kind of overconfidence Earthfleet had hoped for. The Vorlans were not expecting a fight. They were expecting an easy demonstration of power. Elena called a meeting with her senior officers aboard the Hammerfall. She had 4 ships under her direct command at that point: the Hammerfall itself and 3 smaller support vessels, along with several squadrons of fighters and a scattering of automated defense platforms hidden throughout the system. It was not enough to face 12 Vorlan warships in an open, straightforward battle. But Elena Reyes did not intend to fight an open, straightforward battle. She intended to do what humanity had always done when facing a stronger enemy: strike first, strike hard, and disappear before the enemy could recover. The plan she presented to her officers was simple in concept, though difficult in execution. Rather than meeting the Vanguard wing head-on, Earthfleet's ships would use the system's asteroid fields and debris clusters to approach from multiple angles at once, staying hidden until the last possible moment. The Hammerfall's railspike weapon, along with similar weapons mounted on the support vessels, would target the Vorlan ship's engines and weapon systems first, aiming to cripple rather than immediately destroy, forcing confusion and disorder into their formation. Fighters would then move in to finish off any ships that had been disabled, while the larger vessels retreated before the Vorlans could organize an effective counterattack. It was a plan built entirely around speed, surprise, and the willingness to strike without warning, values the Vorlan Empire had never needed to develop in 300 years of uncontested conquest. Some of Elena's officers worried about the ethics of such an attack, striking without any formal declaration or warning. Elena reminded them that the Empire itself had already delivered its terms, an ultimatum with a single day to respond, and had shown, through the death of the Golden Word's own crew, that it viewed diplomacy as a formality rather than a genuine offer. Humanity was not obligated to fight fair against an enemy that had made clear it intended to conquer them regardless of any response. The officers agreed, and preparations began immediately. For 6 days, the Vanguard wing searched the system without finding what it was looking for. Kellen Thur grew increasingly frustrated, sending reports back toward the approaching main fleet that described the human system as strangely quiet, its defenses either hidden with impressive skill or, as he began to suspect, simply exaggerated by fear after the loss of the Golden Word. He began to relax his formation, spreading his ships further apart to cover more of the system in less time, eager to have a full report ready before Grand Admiral Val's arrival. It was exactly the mistake Elena Reyes had been waiting for. On the 7th day, 3 of the 12 Vorlan ships moved into a position near a dense asteroid field on the outer edge of the system, a field that Earthfleet's sensor teams had specifically identified weeks earlier as a perfect hiding place for an ambush. Hidden among the rocks, 2 of Earthfleet's support vessels, the UES Kestrel and the UES Ironwood, waited in complete silence, their engines cold, their sensors passive only, giving away nothing. When the 3 Vorlan ships passed close enough, the 2 human vessels fired their railspike weapons simultaneously, targeting the lead ship's engine section from a range so close that the Vorlon defense systems had almost no time to react. The lead Vorlon ship, a cruiser called the Bright Talon, took 2 direct hits to its rear engine block. The kinetic force of the impact was unlike anything its armor had been designed to withstand. Vorlon ship armor, refined over centuries, was extremely effective against energy weapons and standard projectile fire, spreading and dispersing the force of most attacks across a wide area. But the Railspike's projectiles moved so fast and struck with such a narrow, concentrated point of impact that the armor simply could not disperse the force in time. The Bright Talon's engine section was torn apart, venting atmosphere and fuel into space, leaving the ship dead in the water, unable to maneuver or retreat. The 2 remaining Vorlon ships in that group immediately turned to engage, opening fire on the position where the attack had come from. But Elena's ships had already begun to move, using the asteroid field itself as cover, weaving between the rocks in patterns their pilots had spent weeks practicing in simulations. The Vorlan energy weapons, designed for engagements at longer ranges against enemies who did not use terrain this aggressively, struggled to track targets that kept disappearing behind solid rock, only to reappear somewhere else entirely. In the confusion, the UES Kestrel scored a second hit, this time on one of the 2 remaining ships, damaging its weapon systems and forcing it to break off and retreat toward the rest of the Vanguard wing. Kellen Thur received the report of the attack with disbelief. In the span of a few minutes, one of his ships had been crippled and another damaged by an enemy his sensors had not even detected until the moment they opened fire. He ordered the rest of the Vanguard wing to regroup and converge on the asteroid field, determined to crush whatever human force had dared to strike his ships. It was, again, exactly what Elena Reyes had expected him to do. As the remaining 9 Vorlon ships moved to converge, they left their original scattered formation behind, drawing closer together in a tighter defensive cluster, believing that concentrated numbers would protect them from further surprise attacks. But this concentration created a new vulnerability. Earth Fleet's automated defense platforms, small unmanned devices that had been hidden throughout the system for weeks, activated in sequence as the Vorlon ships passed near their positions. These platforms were simple, cheap to build, and carried no crew to lose, but each one carried a single powerful railspike charge, capable of firing once before being destroyed. As the Vorlon cluster moved through a debris field near the system's 3rd planet, 4 of these platforms fired in near-simultaneous bursts, striking 2 more Vorlon ships and forcing the entire Vanguard wing into chaos. Kellen Thur, now facing the loss or damage of nearly half his force from an enemy he could barely detect, made the decision that would ultimately save what remained of his command, though it would do nothing to save his reputation. He ordered a full retreat, pulling his remaining ships back toward the edge of the system to regroup and await the arrival of the main armada. It was a humiliating order to give, but it was the correct one. Elena Reyes, watching the Vorlon ships withdraw, did not order her forces to pursue. She had accomplished exactly what she set out to do: cripple a portion of the enemy's forward element, demonstrate to her own people that the Vorlon Empire could bleed, and gather as much data as possible on Vorlon ship design, weapons, and tactics before the much larger battle that was still to come. By the time the Vanguard wing regrouped at the edge of the system, it had lost 1 ship entirely, the Bright Talon, whose crew had been forced to evacuate before its reactor overloaded and destroyed what remained of the hull. 2 more ships had suffered serious damage to their engines and weapon systems, and would need significant repair before they could fight effectively again. Of the 12 ships that had entered the system with such confidence 8 days earlier, only 9 remained combat-ready, and every officer among them now understood, in a way words alone could never have taught them, that the destruction of the Golden Word had not been luck. Kellen Thur composed his report to Grand Admiral Val with great difficulty. He had entered the human system expecting an easy demonstration, and had instead lost a ship and suffered serious damage to 2 others, at the hands of an enemy force he still could not accurately estimate in size or number. He described the human tactics in detail, the use of hidden positions, the devastating kinetic weapons that ignored much of the Empire's standard armor design, and the disciplined, almost ruthless precision with which the humans had struck and then vanished before any effective counterattack could be organized. He did not try to hide the extent of the defeat, knowing that any attempt to downplay it would only make things worse. once the Grand Admiral saw the sensor logs for himself. The report reached Threxus Val, while the main armada was still several days from the system's edge. He read it in his private quarters aboard his flagship, the massive dreadnought known as the Empire's Will, the single most powerful warship the Vorlon Empire had ever built. His first reaction, as it had been with the destruction of the Golden Word, was disbelief. But this time, the evidence was harder to dismiss. 12 ships, an experienced commander, and still the humans had inflicted serious losses while suffering none of their own that could be confirmed. For the first time since the campaign began, a small doubt crept into the mind of a man who had never known real doubt in 3 centuries of victory. He called Corvain Des to his quarters, the one officer who had voted against the campaign and who had studied the destruction of the Golden Word more carefully than anyone else. Corvain arrived expecting to be dismissed or reprimanded for his earlier caution, but instead found the Grand Admiral standing quietly before a display showing Kellenthur's report, his expression unreadable. Threxus Val asked Corvain a single question. Was it possible that humanity possessed technology or tactics that the Empire genuinely did not understand, rather than simply being an unusually aggressive but ultimately weak species that had gotten lucky twice? Corvain answered honestly. He believed it was not only possible but likely. He pointed to the pattern in both engagements, the precision of the strikes, the use of terrain and concealment, the willingness to strike first without warning and retreat before a counterattack could form. This was not the behavior of a species relying on luck. It was the behavior of a species with a long, painful history of fighting real wars against real enemies, a history that had taught them, over and over, exactly how to fight an opponent stronger than themselves. The Vorlon Empire, by contrast, had not fought a genuinely difficult war in 300 years. Every tactic, every strategy, every piece of doctrine in the Empire's military had been built around the assumption that Vorlon's strength alone would be enough to win. Corvain warned that this assumption might no longer be safe. Threxus Val listened carefully, and for the first time, he did not dismiss the warning outright. He ordered increased caution as the main armada approached the system, tighter formations, more frequent sensor sweeps, and a full review of every piece of data gathered from both the Golden Word's destruction and the Vanguard Wing's failed scouting mission. But caution, for a man who had spent 300 years never truly needing it, was a difficult habit to build in a matter of days. Even as he ordered these precautions, some part of him still believed that the true weight of the Ashfire Armada, 206 warships strong, would be more than enough to overwhelm whatever forces humanity could muster, no matter how clever their tactics had been so far. On Earth, Elena Reyes reviewed the results of the engagement with a grim sense of satisfaction, mixed with worry. Her forces had won, but the victory had come against only a small forward element of the true Vorlan fleet, not the main armada itself. Sensor data gathered from the engagement, along with intelligence pulled from the wreckage of the Bright Talon before it was fully destroyed, gave Earth Fleet valuable information about Vorlan armor composition, weapon ranges, and standard formation tactics. This data was immediately shared across every remaining human shipyard and defense platform, allowing engineers to refine their weapons and armor even further in the time that remained before the main fleet arrived. But Elena also understood, better than almost anyone, exactly how much larger the true threat was. 12 ships had been difficult enough to defeat using every advantage of surprise, terrain, and preparation that Earth Fleet possessed. The main armada, according to the intelligence gathered from captured Vorlan communication buoys and long-range sensor sweeps, numbered over 200 warships, including vessels far larger and more powerful than anything in the Vanguard Wing. There would be no element of true surprise against a fleet that large. No way to hide Earth Fleet's full strength once the battle truly began. Whatever plan Earth Fleet built for the coming engagement would need to rely on more than clever ambushes and hidden positions. It would need every lesson humanity had ever learned about war, applied with a precision and a ruthlessness that no enemy of the Vorlan Empire had ever shown before. Elena called Earth Fleet Command into emergency session, presenting her findings and her concerns before the assembled leadership of humanity's unified defense force. She did not sugarcoat the situation. Humanity had won 2 engagements, but both had been against a small fraction of the true enemy force, using every advantage of surprise that would not be available a second time. The coming battle, when the full Ashfire Armada arrived, would be the greatest test humanity had ever faced, greater than any war fought between nations in all of human history. She asked for every resource Earthfleet could provide, every ship, every weapon, every trained crew member willing to fight, because the battle that was coming would decide not just the fate of a single system, but the fate of the entire human species. The Earthfleet Command approved every request without hesitation. Shipyards across the solar system entered a state of continuous production, working around the clock to complete as many new vessels as possible before the Armada's arrival. Weapons researchers, working from the data gathered in the recent engagement, began developing new variations of the railspike design, some intended to punch even deeper through armor, others designed for rapid fire against smaller, faster targets like fighters and support craft. Every available pilot, engineer, and soldier was called into active service, and training programs that would normally have taken months were compressed into days, teaching new crews everything Earthfleet had learned about fighting the Vorlon Empire in the short time humanity had known of its existence. Elena Reyes returned to the Hammerfall to oversee the final preparations personally, walking the length of her ship and speaking with every department, every engineer, every gunner who would soon face the largest fleet ever assembled in the history of the Vorlon Empire. She did not promise her crew an easy victory. She did not promise them survival. She promised them only that Earthfleet would make the Empire pay a price for this system, unlike any price it had ever paid before, and that whatever happened in the coming battle, the Vorlon Empire would never again be able to call its conquests easy. Far beyond the edge of the system, the Ashfire Armada continued its approach. 206 warships moving through the dark in a formation built from 3 centuries of unbroken victory, carrying a Grand Admiral whose confidence, for the first time in his long career, had begun to waver just slightly, and an officer named Corvain Des, who watched the growing distance to the human system with a quiet, uneasy feeling that the Empire was about to learn a lesson it had never needed to learn before, and that the cost of that lesson might be higher than anyone in the Dominion Council had ever imagined. The Ashfire Armada arrived at the edge of the human system, 12 days after the battered remains of the Vanguard wing limped back to report their failure. It was the largest fleet the Vorlon Empire had ever gathered in one place, 206 warships stretching across the dark in a formation so vast that human sensors first mistook it for a strange cluster of asteroids before realizing what they were truly looking at. At the center of the formation sailed the Empire's Will, a dreadnought nearly 3 kilometers long, bristling with weapons batteries and shielded by armor plating thicker than any ship the Empire had ever built before. Grand Admiral Threxus Val stood on its bridge, watching the human system grow closer on the main display, and despite the doubts that had crept into his mind since receiving Kellen Thur's report, he could not help but feel a familiar confidence returning at the sight of his own fleet's overwhelming strength. Threxus Val had spent the 12 days of travel reorganizing his approach. Rather than repeating the mistake of sending a small, overconfident scouting force ahead of the main fleet, he ordered the entire Ashfire Armada to advance together, in a tight defensive formation, designed to eliminate the kind of scattered vulnerability that had cost Kellen Thur 2 of his ships. Sensor drones were sent ahead in large numbers, spread across a wide area, sacrificing stealth for sheer coverage, so that no hidden human position could remain undetected for long. He also ordered every ship in the fleet to review the sensor data recovered from the earlier engagements, studying the strange kinetic weapons humanity had used and preparing countermeasures where possible. It was, by Vorlon standards, an unusually cautious approach. But caution built in 12 days could not undo 3 centuries of assuming that raw numbers alone would always be enough. As the Armada crossed into the outer edge of the system, Threxus Val broadcast a new message toward the human homeworld, giving humanity one final chance to surrender before the invasion began. The message was shorter than the first ultimatum delivered by the Golden Word, and far less patient. It stated simply that the Vorlon Empire had returned in overwhelming force, that further resistance would result in the complete destruction of humanity's military capability, and that any hope of survival now rested entirely on immediate and unconditional surrender. Earthfleet Command received the message and debated its response for less than an hour. There would be no surrender. Elena Reyes, present at the meeting, alongside every senior officer and political leader still connected to the Unified Defense Command, made the case that had already convinced nearly everyone in the room days earlier. Surrender to an empire that had killed its own ambassador's counterpart without hesitation, that viewed conquest as a natural right, would not save humanity. It would only delay its destruction, trading a chance at a difficult, costly victory for the certainty of a slow, permanent loss of freedom. The final vote among Earth's remaining governments was unanimous. Humanity would fight. In the days since the destruction of the Vanguard Wing's forward elements, Earth fleet had used every hour available to prepare. 4 new Hammerfall-class vessels had been completed and rushed into service, bringing Elena Reyes's direct combat force to a total of 8 warships, still a tiny fraction of the Vorlon Armada's 206, but each one carrying weapons refined using data gathered from the earlier battle. Alongside these warships, Earth fleet had assembled a much larger force of smaller vessels, fighters, gunboats, and armed shuttles, crewed by pilots who had trained for years in humanity's own wars, before ever hearing of the Vorlon Empire. Hundreds of automated defense platforms, similar to the ones used in the earlier ambush, had been placed throughout the system, hidden among asteroid fields, moons, and debris clusters, each one carrying a single powerful weapon and no crew to risk. It was not, by any honest measure, a fleet capable of matching the Ashfire Armada ship for ship. Elena Reyes understood this better than anyone, and she built her battle plan around a simple truth that had guided human warfare for centuries. When you cannot match your enemy's strength, you make your enemy's strength work against them. Before the final battle plan could be explained, it is worth understanding exactly what the UES Hammerfall was, and why a single ship of its class had already proven capable of destroying a Vorlon cruiser in a matter of minutes. The Hammerfall had been designed and built in the 2 years between humanity's first detection of an approaching alien presence and the arrival of the Golden Word, a period during which every major shipbuilding nation on Earth had set aside its old rivalries to pool resources, knowledge, and industry into a single unified project. The design drew on centuries of naval and military engineering, combined with breakthroughs in materials science and propulsion that had been developed but never fully applied, before the threat of alien contact gave humanity a reason to rush them into production. The ship's hull was built from a layered composite material, stronger and lighter than anything the Vorlon Empire used in its own construction, designed specifically to absorb and redirect kinetic impacts, rather than simply resisting them through sheer mass. Its engines, while smaller than those found on most Vorlon warships of similar size, were built for rapid acceleration and tight maneuvering, rather than sustained top speed, giving Hammerfall-class vessels an ability to change direction and position far faster than their larger, heavier Vorlon counterparts. This maneuverability had already proven critical in the earlier engagement, allowing Elena's ships to weave through the asteroid field while Vorlon energy weapons struggled to track them. The true heart of the Hammerfall's design, however, was its main weapon, the rail spike. Rather than relying on energy-based weapons like most spacefaring civilizations, including the Vorlon Empire, human engineers had focused on a purely kinetic solution, drawing on old, almost forgotten concepts from 20th and 21st century railgun research that had never been fully developed for lack of a clear military need. Using powerful electromagnetic coils, the rail spike accelerated a small, dense metal projectile to a significant fraction of the speed of light before release, giving it a kinetic energy on impact that no known shielding technology, Vorlon or otherwise, had been designed to fully stop. Because the weapon relied on physical mass and speed rather than energy that could be absorbed or redirected by shields, it bypassed much of the defensive technology the Vorlon Empire had spent centuries perfecting against other energy-based weapons. There were trade-offs to this design. The rail spike required enormous amounts of power to charge between shots, meaning Hammerfall-class vessels could not fire as rapidly as ships using conventional energy weapons. Each shot had to count. This limitation had shaped every aspect of Earth fleet's tactics, forcing crews to develop extraordinary discipline and precision, striking only when a shot was almost certain to hit a critical target, rather than relying on volume of fire to eventually land a hit. It was, in its own way, a reflection of humanity's broader situation against the Vorlon Empire. Unable to match the enemy's numbers, human tactics instead focused entirely on making every action count. Elena Reyes had commanded the Hammerfall since its completion, and she had spent every day since studying not just her own ship's capabilities, but everything Earth fleet could learn about Vorland tactics, technology, and psychology. She understood, from the destruction of the Golden Word and the failed scouting mission that followed it, that the Vorlan Empire had built its entire military doctrine around 300 years of overwhelming, uncontested strength. Vorlan commanders were trained to expect victory, not to plan carefully for the possibility of defeat. Their formations, their tactics, and even their ship designs reflected an assumption that no enemy could truly threaten them if enough firepower was brought to bear. This assumption, Elena believed, was the greatest weakness the Vorlan Empire possessed, greater even than any weakness in their weapons or armor. An enemy who had never truly needed to adapt would struggle to adapt quickly now, no matter how much raw power they commanded. With this understanding, Elena built her battle plan for the coming engagement around 3 core principles. Principles she explained carefully to every officer and crew member under her command in the days before the Ashfire Armada's arrival. The first was concealment and deception. Earthfleet's true numbers and positions would remain hidden for as long as possible, using decoys, passive sensors, and the natural cover of the system's asteroid fields and debris clusters to prevent the Vorlan Empire from ever gaining an accurate picture of what they were truly facing. The second was concentrated, precise force. Rather than spreading Earthfleet's limited number of warships evenly across the system, Elena planned to mass her most powerful vessels for sudden, overwhelming strikes against key targets, particularly enemy command ships and supply vessels, aiming to cause maximum disruption with minimum exposure. The third, and perhaps most important, was the willingness to sacrifice smaller assets to protect larger goals. Automated defense platforms, decoy ships, and even some crewed vessels would be used not simply to win individual engagements, but to draw the enemy fleet into positions and formations that would make them vulnerable to the larger strikes still to come. Central to this plan was a target Elena had identified weeks earlier through careful analysis of Vorlan communication patterns and fleet movements. The Empire's will itself, Grand Admiral Threxus Val's flagship. Elena understood that in a military culture as centralized and hierarchical as the Vorlan Empire's, the loss or crippling of the fleet's command vessel would cause disruption far beyond the loss of a single ship, no matter how powerful that ship was. Vorlan commanders, trained for centuries to follow clear, top-down orders from experienced superiors, might struggle to coordinate effectively if their central command structure was suddenly thrown into chaos. Striking the Empire's will directly would be extraordinarily difficult and dangerous, likely requiring Earthfleet's best ships to expose themselves at the very heart of the enemy formation. But if it succeeded, it could turn the tide of the entire battle in a way no amount of smaller victories ever could. As the Ashfire Armada crossed into the outer edge of the system, Threxus Val organized his 206 ships into a formation designed for both offense and defense, a massive sphere of warships with the Empire's will and several other command and support vessels protected at the very center, surrounded by layers of combat ships, arranged to intercept any attack from any direction. It was, by any conventional military standard, an almost impenetrable formation, built specifically to prevent the kind of surprise attacks that had cost the Vanguard wing so dearly. Sensor drones spread out ahead of the main formation in a wide net, sweeping every asteroid field and debris cluster they passed, determined to detect any hidden human position before the fleet came within striking range. For the first 3 days after entering the system, this cautious approach worked exactly as intended. Vorlan sensor drones located and destroyed several of Earthfleet's automated defense platforms before they could be used, their locations given away by the sheer thoroughness of the search. Elena Reyes, watching the reports come in from her command post aboard the Hammerfall, felt a growing tension as she realized just how much more careful this approach was compared to the reckless confidence shown by Kellen Thur's scouting force. The Vorlan Empire had learned, at least partially, from its earlier mistakes. But even a more careful search could not account for everything. Earthfleet's engineers, drawing on the lessons of the first engagement, had developed a new generation of hidden positions specifically designed to evade the kind of wide-area sensor sweeps the Vorlan drones were now conducting. Some defense platforms were buried partially within the icy surface of small moons, their emissions masked by the natural radiation of the moon itself. Others were disguised as ordinary debris, drifting in slow, natural orbits that gave no hint of the weapon systems hidden within. Elena's larger warships, meanwhile, remained fully powered down in deep positions far from the Armada's projected path, waiting for the precise moment when their intervention would matter most, rather than risking early detection for no meaningful gain. On the fourth day of the Armada's advance, Threxus Val received a report that troubled him more than any single piece of intelligence gathered since the campaign began. Long-range sensor sweeps had detected clear evidence of significant industrial activity near the human homeworld, shipyards operating at a pace far beyond what a species this young should have been capable of sustaining. Estimates of humanity's total military production, based on radiation signatures and energy output from these shipyards, suggested that Earth fleet's numbers might be growing, even as the Ashfire Armada approached, rather than remaining static as the Empire's initial assessments had assumed. Threxus Val called Corvain Des to review this new data personally, and the older officer's response only deepened the Grand Admiral's growing unease. Corvain pointed out something that had troubled him since the earliest reports of human resistance. This was a species whose technological development did not follow the pattern the Empire had observed in every other civilization it had ever conquered. Most species, when first encountered by the Vorlan Empire, showed a slow, steady rate of military and industrial development, the natural result of societies that had never faced an existential threat urgent enough to force rapid change. Humanity, by contrast, appeared to be accelerating its development at a pace the Empire had never seen before, driven by the direct and immediate threat of the Vorlan invasion itself. Every engagement, every piece of data Earthfleet gathered about Vorlan tactics and technology seemed to be immediately incorporated into new ship designs and new tactics, in a cycle of adaptation the Empire's own slow, hierarchical military culture simply could not match. Threxus Val considered ordering a temporary halt to the fleet's advance, giving his forces more time to gather intelligence before committing to a full engagement. But pride, and the knowledge that any delay would be reported back to the Dominion Council as a sign of weakness, ultimately overruled his growing caution. He ordered the Ashfire Armada to continue its advance toward the human homeworld, maintaining the same careful defensive formation, but increasing the pace of the approach in the hope of engaging the main human force before its adaptation and growth could continue any further. As the Armada drew closer to Earth itself, Elena Reyes made the final preparations for the battle she had spent weeks planning. She gathered her senior officers for one last briefing aboard the Hammerfall, walking them through every stage of the engagement to come. The battle, she explained, would unfold in phases, each one designed to wear down and disorient the Vorlan fleet before the critical strike against the Empire's will could be attempted. Automated defense platforms and decoy vessels would draw the outer layers of the Vorlan formation into scattered, disorganized pursuit. Earthfleet's fighter squadrons, faster and more maneuverable than anything the Vorlan Empire had ever needed to build, would target enemy support and supply vessels, disrupting the Armada's ability to sustain a long engagement. And when the moment was right, when the enemy formation had been sufficiently disrupted and distracted, Elena's own warships, including the Hammerfall itself, would make a direct strike at the heart of the Vorlan formation, aiming to cripple or destroy the Empire's will before its overwhelming firepower could be brought fully to bear. It was an enormous risk, built on the hope that Vorlan discipline and command structure would prove as rigid and vulnerable as Elena believed. If she was wrong, if the Vorlan fleet adapted quickly enough to protect its flagship and respond effectively to Earthfleet's scattered, deceptive tactics, the battle could turn into a straightforward war of attrition that humanity had no realistic hope of winning. But Elena Reyes had studied 300 years of Vorlan military history, gathered from every piece of data Earthfleet had managed to intercept or recover, and she had found no evidence, not once, of any Vorlan commander successfully adapting to an enemy that refused to fight the way the Empire expected. She was willing to stake the survival of her species on the belief that this pattern would hold, one final time, against the greatest fleet the Vorlan Empire had ever assembled. On the 7th day since entering the system, Vorlan sensor drones finally detected clear signs of a significant human force gathering near a cluster of moons on the far side of Earth's largest planetary neighbor. Grand Admiral Threxus Val, believing he had finally located the true strength of Earthfleet, ordered the Ashfire Armada to advance directly toward this position, confident that the overwhelming size of his fleet would crush whatever force humanity had managed to assemble. He did not yet know that what his sensors had detected was only a fraction of Earth Fleet's true strength, carefully positioned and revealed at exactly the moment and in exactly the manner Elena Reyes had intended. The greatest battle in the short history of humanity's contact with the stars was about to begin, and neither side, despite all their preparation, could be entirely certain of how it would end. The battle began, as Elena Reyes had planned, with a lie. Vorlin's sensor drones had detected a cluster of human ships gathered near a group of moons orbiting the system's largest gas giant, and Grand Admiral Threxus Val, eager to finally bring his overwhelming force to bear against a visible target, ordered the Ashfire Armada to advance directly toward that position. What his drones had detected, however, was not the true heart of Earth Fleet, but a carefully assembled decoy force, a mixture of older, less valuable ships, automated platforms rigged to broadcast false sensor signatures, and just enough real crewed vessels to make the formation appear genuine under a distant scan. Elena had chosen this location specifically because the gas giant's powerful magnetic field created natural interference that would prevent any Vorlin sensor drone from getting close enough for a truly detailed reading before the battle was already underway. As the Ashfire Armada moved into attack range, its formation began to shift, layers of warships peeling away from the main defensive sphere to encircle and engage the human decoy force. Threxus Val watched from the bridge of the Empire's will as nearly 60 of his warships moved to surround what his sensors told him was the primary human fleet, confident that such overwhelming numbers would end the engagement within minutes. For the first few moments, it seemed as though his confidence was justified. The decoy force offered only scattered, disorganized resistance, a handful of automated platforms firing single desperate shots before being destroyed. Older ships retreating in what looked like panic, rather than the disciplined withdrawal it actually was. It was exactly the picture Elena Reyes wanted the Vorlin Empire to see. As the 60-ship detachment fully committed itself to pursuing and destroying the decoy force, spreading out across a wide area of space to hunt down retreating human vessels, the rest of the Ashfire Armada remained in its defensive sphere formation near the gas giant, waiting for confirmation that the primary threat had been eliminated before advancing further. This was the moment Elena had been waiting for. The detachment sent to destroy the decoy force had drawn itself away from the protection of the main fleet, scattered across open space in pursuit of targets that were, one by one, leading them deeper into a region of the system Earth Fleet had spent weeks preparing. Hidden among a dense field of ice fragments left over from a shattered moon, dozens of automated defense platforms and 3 additional Earth Fleet warships waited in complete silence. As the pursuing Vorlin ships entered the field, believing they were closing in on the last scattered remnants of a defeated human force, the trap was sprung. Railspike weapons fired from every hidden position at once. A coordinated volley aimed specifically at engine sections and weapon batteries, rather than attempting to destroy entire ships outright. The goal was not simply to kill, but to cripple as many enemy vessels as possible in the shortest amount of time, turning organized warships into drifting, defenseless wrecks that could be dealt with later or simply ignored for the remainder of the battle. The result was devastating. 12 Vorlin ships were crippled or destroyed in the opening minutes of the ambush, their crews thrown into chaos as weapons they had never encountered before tore through armor that had never failed them in 300 years of previous engagements. The remaining ships in the pursuing detachment scattered in confusion, some attempting to retreat toward the main fleet, others turning to fight an enemy they still could not clearly locate among the ice and debris. Earthfleet's warships, having delivered their opening strike, immediately began to withdraw deeper into the field, using its natural cover to avoid the scattered and disorganized return fire from the surviving Vorlin vessels. Word of the ambush reached Threxus Val within minutes, and for the first time since the campaign began, he felt something close to genuine alarm. In the span of a single engagement, he had lost more ships than the entire Vorlin Empire had lost in any previous campaign across 300 years. He ordered the remaining ships of the scattered detachment to regroup and return to the safety of the main fleet immediately, abandoning any further pursuit of the decoy force. He also ordered the main armada to tighten its formation even further, drawing every remaining warship closer to the protection of the Empire's will, determined not to make the same mistake of scattering his forces across open space again. This, too, was exactly what Elena Reyes had hoped for. A tightly packed formation, drawn together by fear of further ambush, created a different kind of vulnerability than a scattered one. Where a spread-out fleet was difficult to strike with concentrated force but easy to isolate and pick apart piece by piece, a tightly packed formation was nearly impossible to isolate, but presented a single, dense target that, if the outer layers could be sufficiently disrupted, would leave the ships at its center dangerously exposed. Elena had built her entire battle plan around this exact dilemma, understanding that whichever way the Vorlon Empire chose to respond to Earthfleet's tactics, it would create an opportunity that could be exploited, so long as humanity was patient enough to wait for the right moment. As the Ashfire Armada drew into its tightened formation, Earthfleet's fighter squadrons began the next phase of the battle. Dozens of small, fast, heavily armed fighters, flown by pilots who had trained for years in humanity's own conflicts before ever learning of the Vorlon Empire, launched from hidden positions throughout the system, and converged on the tightened Vorlan formation from multiple directions at once. These fighters were far too small and fast for the Ashfire Armada's main weapon batteries, designed to engage large, slow-moving warships rather than swarms of tiny, agile craft, to effectively target. Vorlon point defense systems, built to intercept small numbers of incoming projectiles or missiles, struggled to cope with the sheer number and speed of the human fighters swarming through the formation. The fighters did not attempt to engage the larger Vorlon warships directly, knowing that even a single hit from a capital ship's main weapons would destroy them instantly. Instead, they targeted the Armada's supply and support vessels, the ships responsible for carrying fuel, ammunition, and repair supplies for the rest of the fleet. These support vessels, positioned near the center of the formation for protection, had never needed strong defenses of their own in 300 years of uncontested Vorlan dominance, and they proved almost helpless against the fast, precise strikes of Earthfleet's fighter squadrons. One by one, supply vessels were disabled or destroyed, their cargo of fuel and ammunition scattering into space or detonating in bright, chaotic explosions that further disrupted the tightly packed Vorlon formation. Threxus Val, watching the chaos unfold from the bridge of the Empire's will, ordered his largest warships to break formation and pursue the human fighters directly, hoping that overwhelming firepower could clear the swarm before further damage was done to his supply lines. But the fighters, faster and more maneuverable than anything the Vorlon Empire had ever needed to build, simply scattered and retreated whenever a larger ship turned to engage them, only to regroup and strike again from a different direction moments later. Corvain Des, watching from his own ship within the formation, recognized the pattern immediately. This was not a battle being fought for territory or immediate destruction. This was a battle being fought to exhaust, confuse, and disorganize an enemy that had never needed to develop the patience or flexibility to deal with tactics like these. By the time the fighter assault began to withdraw, having destroyed or disabled nearly a third of the Armada's supply and support vessels, the once precise and disciplined Vorlon formation had become something closer to a confused, sprawling mass of ships, still powerful, still vastly larger than anything Earthfleet could match directly, but no longer moving with the coordinated precision that had defined Vorlon military doctrine for 3 centuries. Threxus Val, struggling to reassert control over his scattered formation, ordered every ship to hold position and await new orders, determined to reorganize before continuing the advance toward Earth itself. It was in this moment of confusion and reorganization that Elena Reyes gave the order for the final and most dangerous phase of her battle plan. The Hammerfall, along with 3 other Hammerfall-class warships, had remained hidden throughout the entire battle, their engines cold, their positions carefully chosen weeks earlier, based on careful analysis of exactly where the Vorlon formation was likely to end up, once the earlier phases of the engagement had run their course. As the disorganized Vorlon fleet paused to regroup, these 4 ships activated their engines and began a high-speed approach directly toward the heart of the formation, toward the Empire's will itself. Vorlon sensors detected the approaching human warships almost immediately, and Threxus Val ordered every nearby ship to converge and intercept before the human vessels could get close enough to pose a genuine threat to the flagship. But the same confusion and disorganization that had spread through the fleet during the earlier phases of the battle now worked against a quick, coordinated response. Ships that should have been positioned to protect the Empire's will were scattered across a wide area, some still recovering from the fighter assault, others uncertain of their exact position within the reorganizing formation. The human ships, small, fast, and precisely coordinated, found gaps in the Vorlon defense that would never have existed in a properly organized formation. Elena Reyes stood on the bridge of the Hammerfall, watching the massive shape of the Empire's will grow larger on her display with every passing second. She knew this was the most dangerous moment of the entire battle, the moment where months of careful planning would either pay off completely or fail catastrophically, exposing her best remaining ships to the full firepower of the Vorlon Empire's most powerful warship. She ordered her small group of ships to split into two pairs, approaching the Empire's will from different angles simultaneously, forcing its defenses to divide their attention, rather than concentrating entirely on a single approach vector. The first pair of Hammerfall-class ships drew heavy fire from the Empire's will's point defense systems as they closed the distance. One of them, the UES Ironwood, taking significant damage to its forward hull but continuing its approach, its crew refusing to break off despite the danger. The second pair, including the Hammerfall itself, used the chaos and the divided attention of the flagship's defenses to close to an even more dangerous range, closer than any human ship had yet come to a Vorlon capital ship in the entire war. At almost point-blank range, Elena Reyes gave the order to fire. The Hammerfall's rail spike, along with the weapon of its companion vessel, released two projectiles that struck the Empire's will's main reactor housing within seconds of each other. The dreadnought's armor, thicker and more advanced than anything else in the Vorlon fleet, held against the first impact, cracking but not breaking. The second impact, striking almost the exact same point only moments later, was too much for even the Empire's finest armor to withstand. The reactor housing ruptured, and a massive secondary explosion tore through the Empire's will's central sections, crippling its main power systems and throwing the entire ship into darkness as backup systems struggled to compensate for the sudden, catastrophic loss. The Empire's will did not explode entirely, its size and the redundancy built into its systems ultimately saving it from complete destruction, but it was crippled beyond any hope of continuing to command the battle, its main weapons offline, its engines reduced to a fraction of their normal power, its bridge forced to switch to emergency backup systems that could barely maintain basic life support, let alone coordinate the actions of 200 remaining warships spread across the system. Threxus Val, thrown from his command chair by the force of the explosion, found himself in a darkened bridge, filled with the sound of alarms and the smell of burning circuitry, staring at displays that no longer showed the clear, organized picture of his fleet that he had relied on for the entire battle. For the first time in 300 years of Vorlon military history, the Empire's central command structure had been struck at its very heart, and the effects rippled outward through the entire Ashfire armada almost immediately. Ships that had been waiting for orders from the flagship found themselves suddenly cut off, their commanders forced to make independent decisions in a military culture that had never truly trained its officers for that kind of autonomy. Confusion turned to disorder, and disorder, in the chaos of an already difficult battle, began to turn toward panic. Elena Reyes, having delivered the critical strike, did not linger to confirm the full extent of the damage. She ordered an immediate withdrawal, her ships turning and retreating at maximum speed, back toward the cover of the asteroid fields and debris clusters that had protected Earth fleet throughout the entire engagement. The UES Ironwood, badly damaged from the approach, struggled to keep pace, and for several tense minutes it seemed as though the ship might be lost, caught by pursuing Vorlon vessels before it could reach safety. But the same confusion that had spread through the Vorlon fleet after the loss of central command slowed the pursuit just enough, giving the Ironwood's crew the time they needed to nurse their damaged engines back to a functional speed and escape into the cover of a nearby debris field. Across the system, the remaining ships of the Ashfire Armada found themselves without clear direction, their Grand Admiral incapacitated, their command structure shattered, and their formations scattered from the earlier phases of the battle. Some Vorlon commanders, more experienced or more independent-minded than their peers, attempted to organize local counterattacks against the retreating human forces, but without central coordination, these efforts remained scattered and largely ineffective. Others, uncertain of what to do without direct orders from the flagship, simply held their positions, waiting for a command that was not coming anytime soon. Corvain Des, commanding his own ship near the edge of the scattered formation, recognized immediately what had happened and understood better than almost anyone else in the fleet exactly how dangerous the situation had become. He attempted to establish emergency communication with the surviving officers of the Empire's will, hoping to coordinate some kind of organized response before the battle could deteriorate any further. It took nearly an hour to establish even limited contact, and by the time he did, the damage to Vorlon morale and cohesion had already been done. Ships throughout the formation had begun to break away individually, some attempting to continue the fight, others beginning quiet, unauthorized withdrawals toward the edge of the system, unwilling to remain in a battle their commanders no longer seemed capable of directing. Earthfleet, watching this chaos unfold from hidden positions throughout the system, did not immediately press a full counterattack. Elena Reyes understood that her forces, though victorious in this critical exchange, remained vastly outnumbered by the surviving ships of the Ashfire Armada, and that a premature attempt to finish the battle in a single stroke could still result in disaster if the Vorlon fleet found a way to reorganize. Instead, Earthfleet continued the same patient, precise tactics that had defined the entire engagement, striking isolated and vulnerable ships wherever they appeared, using fighters and automated platforms to harass and weaken the scattered Vorlon formation, while the larger warships, including the Hammerfall, withdrew to safety to repair and rearm for whatever might come next. By the time the true scale of the disaster became clear to what remained of the Vorlan command structure, hours after the strike on the Empire's will, the Ashfire Armada had already lost far more than ships. It had lost the one thing that had made it the most feared fleet in 300 years of Vorlan history: absolute, unshakable confidence in its own certain victory. For the first time in longer than any Vorlan officer alive could remember, the Empire's greatest fleet found itself uncertain, scattered, and afraid, facing an enemy that had proven, beyond any possible doubt, that centuries of easy conquest had ended. In the hours after the strike on the Empire's will, the battle did not end with a single dramatic moment, as such things often do in old stories. Instead, it unraveled slowly, like a rope coming apart strand by strand, until nothing remained holding the Ashfire Armada together as a single fighting force. Grand Admiral Threxus Val survived the destruction of his flagship's reactor housing, though he was badly injured, thrown against a bulkhead during the initial explosion, and left with broken bones and a wound to his head that left him drifting in and out of full awareness for several hours. In that time, without clear orders from their commander, the Vorlan fleet's officers were left to make decisions no Vorlan military doctrine had ever truly prepared them for. 3 centuries of top-down command, where junior officers followed the precise instructions of their superiors without question or improvisation, had never needed to build a culture of independent decision-making. When that top-down structure was suddenly severed, the result was not organized resistance, but confusion. Corvain Des did everything in his power to hold the fleet together, using his seniority and his reputation as one of the Empire's most respected commanders to issue what orders he could to nearby ships, urging them to regroup into smaller, defensible formations rather than scattering individually. Some captains listened to him. Others, either out of pride, panic, or simple uncertainty about the chain of command in Threxus Val's absence, made their own decisions. A handful of ships attempted to press forward with an attack on the human homeworld, regardless of the chaos around them, hoping that a bold strike might still salvage the campaign. These ships found themselves isolated from any support, easy targets for Earthfleet's fighters and hidden defense platforms, and were destroyed or crippled within hours of breaking away from the rest of the fleet. Other Vorlan captains, seeing the fate of those who pressed forward, made the opposite choice, pulling their ships back toward the edge of the system, unwilling to risk further losses in a battle that no longer seemed to have any clear leadership or plan behind it. Within a single day of the strike on the Empire's will, the once mighty Ashfire Armada had fractured into dozens of smaller, uncoordinated groups, some fighting, some fleeing, and many simply drifting, uncertain, waiting for orders that were not coming. Elena Reyes watched this disintegration unfold with a mixture of relief and continued caution. She understood that a scattered, confused enemy was still a dangerous one, and she was careful not to let Earth Fleet's own forces become overextended in pursuit of a victory that had not yet been fully secured. Rather than launching an all-out counterattack against the entire fractured armada at once, she ordered her forces to continue the same patient, precise tactics that had won the earlier phases of the battle, isolating and neutralizing smaller groups of Vorlon ships one at a time, always keeping enough of her own strength in reserve to respond if the enemy somehow found a way to reorganize. It took nearly 3 full days for what remained of Vorlon command structure to stabilize. Threxus Val, once he regained enough clarity to understand the scale of the disaster that had unfolded around him, made the most difficult decision of his 300 years of military service. He issued a fleet-wide order, transmitted on every frequency his damaged flagship could still reach, calling for a full withdrawal from the human system. It was the first time in the recorded history of the Vorlon Empire that a Grand Admiral had ordered a retreat from an active campaign. The order, once issued, spread quickly among the scattered remnants of the Ashfire Armada, and ships throughout the system began to disengage and regroup for the long journey back toward Vorlon space. Elena Reyes, watching the withdrawal begin, made the decision not to pursue the retreating fleet beyond the edges of the system itself. Her goal, and the goal of Earth Fleet Command from the very beginning, had never been the complete annihilation of the Vorlon Empire. It had been survival, and the clear, undeniable demonstration that humanity could not be conquered easily. That goal, in the ashes and wreckage scattered throughout the system, had been achieved beyond anything Earth Fleet Command had dared to hope for when the campaign began. When the final count was completed in the days after the Vorlon withdrawal, the scale of the Empire's defeat became fully clear. Of the 206 warships that had entered the system as the Ashfire Armada, only 138 remained combat-capable enough to make the journey home. Dozens more had been destroyed outright, and a significant number of others had been crippled and left drifting, eventually recovered by their own retreating forces but rendered useless for any future campaign without extensive repair. It was, by a wide margin, the single greatest military defeat in the 300-year history of the Vorlon Empire, inflicted by a species that, only months earlier, the Empire's own analysts had classified as an easy, unremarkable target for conquest. Earth Fleet's own losses, while far smaller in raw numbers, were not without cost. The UES Ironwood, despite surviving its dangerous approach to the Empire's will, never fully recovered from the damage sustained during the battle, and was eventually decommissioned, its surviving crew reassigned to newer vessels. Several automated defense platforms and smaller crewed ships had been lost throughout the various phases of the engagement, and dozens of Earth Fleet's pilots and crew members did not survive the battle. Elena Reyes made a point, in the days after the fighting ended, of personally reviewing the record of every human life lost in the defense of the system, a habit she would maintain throughout the rest of her career, refusing to let victory become an excuse to forget the cost at which it had been won. News of the defeat reached the Vorlon Dominion Council on Koth weeks later, carried by the returning remnants of the Ashfire Armada. The reaction within the council chamber was unlike anything in 300 years of Vorlon political history. Some members called for an immediate second invasion, a larger fleet built specifically to erase the humiliation of the defeat and finish what the Ashfire Armada had failed to accomplish. Others, more cautious, argued that any future campaign against humanity would need to be planned with far greater care, using everything the Empire had learned about human tactics and technology, rather than repeating the same overconfident assumptions that had led to disaster. Threxus Val, recovering slowly from his injuries, appeared before the council to give a full account of the battle. He did not attempt to hide or excuse the scale of the defeat. He described in careful detail exactly how Earth Fleet's tactics had exploited every weakness in Vorlon military doctrine, weaknesses that had never mattered before, because the Empire had never faced an enemy capable of finding them. He recommended, above all else, that the Council abandon any plan for an immediate second invasion, arguing that humanity, given time, would only continue to grow stronger and more prepared, just as it had grown stronger in the short weeks between the destruction of the Golden Word and the arrival of the full Armada. Any future conflict with humanity, he warned, would need to be approached not as another easy collection, but as a genuine war against an equal, or perhaps even superior, military power. The Council's final decision, reached after weeks of heated debate, was to withdraw all Vorlon forces from the region surrounding the human system indefinitely, establishing a wide buffer zone and committing significant resources to studying humanity from a safe distance, rather than risking another direct confrontation in the near future. It was not peace, not exactly. The Vorlon Empire did not formally recognize humanity's independence, and many within the Dominion Council continued to view the eventual conquest of Earth as inevitable, simply delayed rather than abandoned. But for the first time since the signal from Earth had first been detected by the scout ship Silent Drifter, humanity was left alone, given the time and space to grow without the immediate threat of invasion. On Earth, the aftermath of the battle brought about changes that would shape humanity's future for generations to come. The unified defense command that had been formed in the face of the Vorlon threat did not disband once the immediate danger had passed. Instead, it evolved into a permanent, unified government structure, the first in human history to bring together the entire species under a single coordinated authority, born not from conquest or ideology, but from the shared experience of standing together against a threat that no single nation could have faced alone. Elena Reyes, reluctant as she was for any kind of political role, found herself elevated to a position of enormous influence within this new government, respected not just for her tactical brilliance, but for the calm, steady leadership she had shown throughout the darkest days of the campaign. Shipyards that had once worked around the clock to build a desperate, hastily assembled defense force continued their work in the years that followed, no longer building ships purely for survival, but for a future humanity had never truly imagined for itself before the Vorlon Empire's arrival. Earthfleet grew steadily stronger, incorporating everything learned from the battle against the Ashfire Armada, developing new technologies, new tactics, and new ships, always with the understanding that the Vorlon Empire's retreat was not necessarily permanent, and that the day might come when humanity would need to defend itself again, or perhaps even venture out to meet the wider galaxy on its own terms. Word of humanity's defeat of the Vorlon Empire's greatest fleet did not remain a secret for long. Other species throughout the region, some of them long since conquered and absorbed into the Vorlon Empire, others still independent but living in constant fear of eventual Vorlon expansion, began to hear rumors and fragments of the story, passed along through smugglers, traders, and the scattered channels of communication that existed at the edges of Vorlon space. The details grew and changed with each retelling, as such stories always do, but the core of it remained the same. A young species, barely capable of leaving its own solar system, had faced the largest fleet the Vorlon Empire had ever assembled, and had not simply survived, but had broken it. For the first time in 300 years, other species began to whisper that the Vorlon Empire was not invincible. Some began, quietly and carefully, to consider what had once seemed unthinkable, that resistance, real resistance, might actually be possible. Grand Admiral Threxus Val never fully recovered his former standing within the Dominion Council, though he was not formally punished for the defeat, having followed proper procedure and shown genuine bravery throughout the battle itself. The humiliation of the loss followed him for the rest of his career. He spent his remaining years studying everything the Empire could learn about humanity, becoming, somewhat unexpectedly, one of the Vorlon Empire's foremost experts on human tactics and technology, driven by a need to understand exactly what had gone wrong, and to ensure that if the Empire ever did return to finish what the Ashfire Armada had started, it would not make the same mistakes twice. Corvain Des, whose early warnings had gone unheeded before the battle, found his reputation and influence within the Council greatly increased in the years that followed. He became a leading voice for caution and careful study in the Empire's future dealings with other species, arguing that the assumption of easy, uncontested conquest that had guided Vorlon expansion for 3 centuries could no longer be trusted, and that the Empire's continued survival and strength would depend on its willingness to learn, adapt, and respect the capabilities of even the smallest, youngest civilizations it encountered. On Earth, Elena Reyes eventually stepped back from active command, though she never fully left public life, spending her later years advising the growing generations of Earthfleet officers who had not personally lived through the darkest days of the Vorlon invasion. She often told them the same thing, a lesson she had learned not from any single battle, but from the long, difficult history of her own species, that strength was not simply a matter of numbers or technology, but of will, of adaptability, and of the refusal to accept defeat as inevitable, no matter how overwhelming an enemy might appear at first glance. The story of the battle became known throughout human history simply as the day the Empire's greatest fleet was ended by a single warship, though those who studied the true history of the campaign understood that it had never truly been about one ship alone, but about an entire species that had refused to be collected like a stone from a beach, and had instead chosen, together, to stand and fight for the freedom to decide its own future among the stars. Centuries of easy conquest had come to an end, not with a whisper, but with the roar of a single kinetic weapon striking true at the heart of an empire that had never once imagined it could lose. And though the Vorlon Empire would remain a power to be reckoned with for generations to come, it would never again look at a young, unproven species and assume, without question, that victory was already guaranteed. Humanity had made certain of that, in a battle that would be remembered, retold, and honored for as long as human ships continued to sail among the stars.